if I told you that 197 elderly rebels chose to live in radioactive villages rather than accept government safety? What if the people who ignored expert warnings about Chernobyl are outliving those who followed official advice? In the forbidden zone of Belarus, time stopped in 1986, but the people who returned are teaching us something profound about fear, home, and what it really means to be alive. I'm about to show you a place where grandparents defeated governments, where radiation became less deadly than relocation, and where the most dangerous thing wasn't invisible particles in the soil. It was trusting someone else to decide what's safe for your life. The ultimate government rebellion. Picture this. It's May 6th, 1986. Armed soldiers are going door to door in Belarusian villages, forcing families to evacuate within hours. They're told they can take only essential items. Everything else, their homes, their animals, their entire way of life, must be abandoned because of invisible radiation from Chernobyl. 24,700 people from 108 settlements obeyed. They climbed onto buses and trains, trusting their government to keep them safe. But here's what nobody expected. Some of them started walking back. Not hundreds, not thousands, just a few dozen elderly villagers who decided that dying at home was better than living in exile. They became known as the Samosili, the self-settlers, and their quiet rebellion would expose one of the most uncomfortable truths about modern safety culture. The government relocated entire communities to concrete apartment blocks in cities like Minsk. These displaced villagers received new homes, medical care, and government pensions. On paper, they were the lucky ones. They were safe from radiation. They were protected by expert knowledge and institutional care. But something unexpected happened in those concrete apartments. The relocated villagers began dying, not from radiation, but from depression, alcoholism, and the psychological destruction of losing their identity. Meanwhile, back in the forbidden zone, the Samosli who had returned illegally were growing their own food, tending their gardens, and outliving their safely relocated neighbors. Today, only 197 Samosli remain across 11 villages. Their average age is 63. They're not dying from radiation poisoning, they're dying of old age, having lived longer than many of the people who followed official evacuation orders. Their rebellion wasn't just against government authority, it was against the entire modern belief that experts know what's best for your life. The Samosli proved something that makes governments deeply uncomfortable. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is trust someone else's definition of safety. Sometimes the experts are wrong, and sometimes home is worth more than a longer life in exile. Imagine walking 130 kilometers on foot, carrying everything you own, while every person you meet treats you like a walking disease. This is exactly what the first Samosli did when they decided to return to their villages in the weeks after evacuation. Maria Urupa was 47 years old when she made this journey. She had been relocated to Kiev, given a small apartment and told she was lucky to be alive. But after 3 weeks of concrete walls and urban noise, she couldn't sleep. She couldn't breathe. She made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She started walking home to her village of Kupovet, 130 kilometers through forests and fields, carrying a suitcase of clothes and jars of preserved food. When she knocked on doors asking for water or maybe just a place to rest, people slammed doors in her face. They had heard about radiation. They believed she was contaminated, dangerous, a walking threat to their families. 3 days she walked alone. No one would give her shelter, no one would share food. The fear of invisible radiation had turned neighbors into strangers and community into isolation. She slept in forests and drank from streams, treated like a plague victim for the crime of just wanting to go home. When she finally reached Kupovate, she found her house exactly as she'd left it. Her chickens had died, her garden was overgrown, but the walls were still standing, the roof still protected her from rain, and for the first time in weeks she could breathe normally. Today, Maria is 85 years old. Her village population dropped from 678 people to just 16. But she's still there, still growing tomatoes in soil that experts say is too dangerous for human habitation, and, she's still outliving people who accepted government safety measures. The 130-kilometer walk wasn't just a journey home, it was a declaration that honestly, some things are worth risking everything for. It was proof that the deepest human need isn't safety, but belonging. The Samosili didn't just return to radioactive villages, they returned to themselves. The government response was swift and harsh. They tried to force the Samosili out repeatedly, cutting off electricity and water supplies, but really you can't defeat people who have already decided they would rather die at home than live in exile. You can't frighten people who have chosen their own acceptable level of risk. The Samosoli's 130-kilometer walk became a metaphor for something larger, the distance between institutional safety and personal freedom, between expert knowledge and lived wisdom, between surviving and truly living. Here's what the Samosoli discovered that most of us never will. Your fear of invisible threats creates very visible prisons. The people who refused to shelter Maria Urupa during her 130-kilometer journey weren't protecting themselves from radiation. They were destroying their own humanity out of panic. Radiation is invisible, odorless, and undetectable without special equipment. It's the perfect fear because you can never prove you're safe from it. You can only trust experts who tell you what levels are acceptable, and that trust becomes a kind of slavery. The evacuated villagers lived in constant anxiety about their health. Every headache became a sign of radiation sickness. Every cough became evidence of cancer. They were given regular medical checkups, their food was monitored, and their living spaces were tested for contamination. They were, in a way, safer than they had ever been in their lives, and yet more terrified than they had ever been. Meanwhile, the Samosoli made a different choice. They decided to trust their own bodies over expert predictions. They chose to eat food from their own gardens rather than government rations. They chose to drink water from their own wells rather than processed city water, and they chose to sleep in beds they had slept in for decades rather than government-issued mattresses. This wasn't ignorance, it was in fact a sophisticated form of risk assessment. The Samosoli calculated that the psychological damage of displacement was more dangerous than the physical risk of radiation. So they chose a known quantity, their ancestral land, over an unknown quantity, life in exile. Life. The numbers proved they were right. The relocated villagers experienced higher rates of depression, suicide, and alcohol-related deaths than the Samosoli who returned. The people who followed expert advice and accepted government safety measures died younger and more miserable than the rebels who ignored warnings and chose their own path. A fear of radiation turned neighbors into enemies, communities into isolation chambers, and safety into a prison. The Samosoli broke out of that prison by accepting that, well, some risks are worth taking. They chose the risk they understood, life in a radioactive village, over the risk they couldn't control, psychological destruction in urban exile. But here's the deeper truth. The Samosoli weren't just resisting radiation fear, they were resisting the entire modern system that tells you to trust institutional expertise over your own judgment, to value safety over meaning, to choose survival over authentic living. Their rebellion wasn't against radiation, it was against the kind of life that prioritizes avoiding death over actually living. Only 197 people remain in the entire Belarusian exclusion zone, scattered across 11 villages. Most are over 65 years old. They have no political power, no economic influence, no ability to threaten anyone. So why do governments still monitor them obsessively? Why do authorities still try to control their movements and restrict their choices? Because the Samosoli destroyed the most important government narrative, that experts know what's best for you. They proved that sometimes the safest thing, according to science, is the most dangerous thing for the human spirit. They demonstrated that institutional knowledge can be wrong, not just about facts, but about what makes life worth living. Every Samosoli still alive is walking proof that, well, obedience to authority can actually be more deadly than disobedience. They're living evidence, that your personal risk assessment might just be more accurate than expert calculations. They're breathing contradictions to the entire modern safety state. Governments can handle traditional rebels. They can arrest protesters, jail political dissidents, and silence critics. But honestly, they can't arrest people for living too long in the wrong place. They can't jail grandmothers for growing vegetables in contaminated soil. They can't silence people whose only crime is outliving expert predictions. The Samosoli represent something far more dangerous to institutional power than political opposition. They represent practical proof that the experts were, well, wrong. Not just mistaken about radiation levels or evacuation timing, but fundamentally wrong about what human beings actually need to survive and thrive. Consider the official response to their survival. Instead of studying why the Samosoli are living longer than relocated villagers, authorities focus on monitoring their radiation exposure. Instead of investigating whether displacement might be more harmful than low-level radiation, they continue to restrict access to the exclusion zone. Instead of questioning whether their safety recommendations were correct, they classify the Samosoli as statistical anomalies. This isn't science, it's institutional self-protection. Admitting that the Samosoli made the right choice would mean admitting that 24,700 people were unnecessarily traumatized by forced relocation. Walk into any Samosoli village today and you'll find something impossible. The Soviet Union perfectly preserved in 1986. Not as a museum or historical recreation, but as a living, breathing reality where time genuinely stopped. The clocks in these villages don't just show the time, they show the exact moment when the modern world abandoned them. May 6th, 1986. The day the buses came, the soldiers arrived, and an entire way of life was declared too dangerous to continue. But here's what makes this time capsule extraordinary. It wasn't preserved by accident or neglect. It was actively chosen. The Samozli didn't just return to their villages, they returned to their identities, their relationships, their entire understanding of what life should be. This isn't nostalgia, it's something far more radical, a conscious rejection of progress, development, and modernization. While the rest of the world chases newer technologies, better medicines, improved living standards, the Samozli chose to freeze their lives at the moment they felt most authentic. The relocated villagers were given modern apartments, with central heating, running water, and electricity. They were integrated into urban economies, provided with modern healthcare, and connected to transportation networks. They were really upgraded to contemporary living standards. But the Samozli chose wooden houses with wood-burning stoves, well water, and oil lamps. They maintained subsistence farming, traditional crafts, and pre-industrial relationships with nature. In fact, they downgraded to what experts considered primitive living conditions. The shocking result is that the people who rejected modern improvements are living longer, happier, and more fulfilled lives than those who accepted them. The Soviet time capsule isn't just surviving, it's thriving in ways that modern life simply can't match. The Samozli didn't just preserve Soviet culture. They preserved a way of being human that modern life tends to destroy. They maintained community bonds, seasonal rhythms, and direct relationships with their environment that, honestly, most people have lost forever. Every year, older Samozli are allowed one visit to cemeteries in the exclusion zone to honor their dead. Just one day to visit graves of parents, spouses, children buried in soil that authorities consider too dangerous for human presence. One day to connect with family members whose memory is supposedly contaminated by radiation. Think about what this policy reveals. Your government decides which radiation levels are safe for your emotions. They determine acceptable exposure times for grief. They regulate how much danger you can accept to maintain human connections that honestly matter more than your own life. Galina Zhukova, 78, makes this annual pilgrimage to visit her husband's grave in the abandoned village of Opachichi. She's allowed exactly 6 hours in the exclusion zone, monitored by officials who measure her radiation exposure and document her activities. After 6 hours, she must leave her husband's grave and return to her current village, where she lives alone because permanent residence in Opachichi is forbidden. For 364 days each year, Galina lives in exile from the place that contains her deepest connections. She's forbidden to tend her husband's grave, clean his headstone, or plant flowers on his burial site. These activities are considered too dangerous for extended exposure to radiation. But here's what makes this policy particularly cruel. Galina is 78 years old. The radiation exposure from living permanently in Opachichi would potentially shorten her life by a few years. The psychological damage from living in isolation, separated from her husband's memory and her ancestral home, is shortening her life right now. Modern safety culture prioritizes quantity of life over quality of life, survival over meaning, biological existence over spiritual connection. It assumes that living longer is always better than living more authentically, that avoiding physical risk is more important than maintaining emotional bonds. The Samozli, well, they reject this calculation. They choose radiation exposure over emotional exile. They choose uncertain physical risks over certain psychological damage, and really they choose to live fully in dangerous places rather than survive safely in meaningless ones. The annual cemetery visits reveal how modern safety becomes a form of cruelty, disguised as protection. Authorities allow just enough connection to prevent complete psychological collapse, but not enough to provide genuine comfort or continuity. It's the minimum viable emotional support, designed more to maintain compliance than to uphold human dignity. The Samozli, who live permanently in the exclusion zone, don't need annual cemetery visits because, well, they never left their dead behind. They tend graves daily, maintain family connections across generations, and live in continuous relationship with their ancestors. They chose the full human experience over the regulated emotional allowances of safety culture. Modern safety, promises to protect you from harm, but it often ends up protecting you from life itself. It creates these sterile environments where you might survive longer, but you actually experience less. It's like it prioritizes avoiding death over actually living. The Samozli discovered, in their own way, that the safest life is often the most dangerous one. Dangerous to your spirit, your identity, your connections to everything that makes existence meaningful. Here's the calculation that changed everything. The Somozili live beyond the 10-kilometer exclusion zone, in areas where radiation levels are elevated but not immediately lethal. They didn't return to the most contaminated areas near the reactor. They didn't ignore science completely. Instead, they did their own risk assessment and, well, chose their own acceptable level of danger. This wasn't reckless bravery, it was, sophisticated decision-making, based on personal priorities that experts couldn't really quantify. They calculated that the psychological damage of displacement was actually more dangerous than the physical effects of low-level radiation exposure. They weighed known quantities, their connection to place, community, and identity, against unknown quantities like the long-term health effects of radiation. The official exclusion zone was drawn in perfect circles around the Chernobyl reactor, based on radiation measurements and computer models. But honestly, radiation doesn't spread in perfect circles. Wind patterns, soil composition, and geographical features create these complex contamination maps that just don't match bureaucratic boundaries. The Samozli understood their specific environment better than distant experts ever could. They knew which areas flooded during spring, which soil was naturally fertile, and which water sources were cleanest. They had generational knowledge about their land that, frankly, no scientific study could replicate. As while experts calculated theoretical risks for average populations, the Samozli calculated actual risks for themselves. They were old enough that cancer risks didn't frighten them. They were experienced enough with hardship that uncertain health effects seemed manageable. They were connected enough to their place that honestly, the psychological risks of displacement seemed more dangerous than the physical risks of radiation. The numbers support their calculation. Radiation-related illnesses among Samozli are lower than predicted by initial expert models. Meanwhile, depression, suicide, and alcohol-related deaths among relocated villagers exceeded all predictions. The people who ignored expert advice are living longer than those who followed it. This wasn't luck, it was better mathematics. The Samozli included variables that experts ignored: the health effects of purpose, community, continuity, and autonomy. They calculated risks that safety science doesn't measure: the danger of losing your identity, the toxicity of institutional dependence, the cancer of meaninglessness. Expert risk assessment assumes that all risks are equal, that physical dangers are always more important than psychological ones, that surviving is always better than thriving. The Samozili's mathematics included the full human experience. They calculated not just how long they might live, but how much their life would be worth living. Their success proves that individual risk assessment can be more accurate than institutional expertise, that personal knowledge can be more valuable than scientific models, that your own judgment about your own life might be more trustworthy than expert opinions about your safety. The Samozli didn't reject science. They rejected the assumption that science knows everything about what makes life worth living. While the Samozli grew food in radioactive soil and built sustainable communities with no outside assistance, international aid organizations distributed billions of dollars in Chernobyl recovery funds across Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. Guess which approach created better outcomes for actual human beings? The numbers are staggering. The European Union alone has provided over 2.3 billion euros in Chernobyl-related aid since 1986. The United Nations established the Chernobyl Recovery and Development Program with hundreds of millions in funding. Individual donor countries contributed additional hundreds of millions for medical care, infrastructure, and research programs. But here's where it gets interesting. Most of this money never reached the people who needed it most. Administrative costs consumed massive portions of aid budgets. Contractor fees, consultant salaries, and institutional overhead absorbed funds that were supposed to help displaced villagers rebuild their lives. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development funded the construction of a massive containment structure over the destroyed Chernobyl reactor, a project that cost over 2.1 billion euros and took nearly 2 decades to complete. Meanwhile, relocated villagers lived in inadequate housing, struggled with poverty, and received minimal support for psychological trauma. International aid prioritized spectacular engineering projects and institutional capacity building over direct human assistance. Donor countries, preferred funding concrete results they could photograph and measure rather than addressing the complex social and psychological needs of displaced communities. The Samozli received zero international aid, no foreign funding, no institutional support, no expert assistance. They rebuilt their communities using only their own resources, traditional knowledge, and mutual cooperation. They created food security through subsistence farming, maintained infrastructure through collective labor, and provided healthcare through traditional remedies and community support. The contrast is remarkable. Billions in international aid failed to create sustainable communities for displaced villagers, while the Samosli created thriving villages with no outside funding at all. The people who received the most expert assistance struggled with poverty, depression, and social breakdown. The people who received no assistance at all achieved the outcomes that aid organizations promised but never delivered. Now, this isn't an argument against international aid in principle. What we're really seeing here is evidence that quite often institutional solutions just fail to address human problems that need personal agency, strong community bonds, and, well, cultural continuity. The Samosli actually succeeded because they were in control of their own recovery process. Meanwhile, aid recipients struggled, mostly because they became dependent on these institutional systems that honestly prioritized bureaucratic efficiency over human dignity. The aid money, it created jobs for international consultants, contracts for construction companies, and sure, research opportunities for academic institutions, but it didn't create the thing that mattered most: communities where people could live meaningful lives after such catastrophic disruption. The Samosli, on the other hand, created exactly that, using nothing but their own determination and traditional knowledge. They proved, in a very real sense, that sometimes the best aid is no aid at all, just the freedom to solve your own problems in your own way. The question every government fears. But here's the question that keeps government officials awake at night. What if the Samosli were right about everything? What if forced relocation was more harmful than radiation exposure? What if modern safety culture creates more danger than it prevents? What if the entire framework of institutional expertise and government protection is built on assumptions that are fundamentally wrong? So the Samosli didn't just survive in those radioactive villages. They actually thrived in ways that, well, the relocated villagers never really did. They managed to maintain community bonds, keep their cultural continuity alive, and hold on to a sense of personal autonomy. Things that, honestly, modern life often tends to destroy. They showed us that human resilience is in fact more powerful than institutional support, that local knowledge is often more practical than expert theory, and that personal choice can be more important than professional guidance. Well, the experts might disagree. It goes to show that community-based solutions can sometimes be more effective than those big institutional programs. And perhaps most importantly, it proves that traditional ways of life might just be more sustainable than the modern alternatives we often take for granted. Now, government officials, they simply can't acknowledge these truths without, seriously undermining their own authority. Admitting that the Samosli made better choices than the expert recommendations would, quite frankly, destroy public trust in institutional expertise. And recognizing that forced relocation caused more harm than radiation exposure would, well, create liability for massive human rights violations. The Samosli represent living proof that another way is possible. They show that you don't have to accept expert definitions of safety, institutional programs for security, or government decisions about what's best for your life. They demonstrate that traditional communities can be more resilient than modern systems, that personal agency can be more valuable than professional care, that human wisdom can be more practical than scientific knowledge. That's what governments really fear, not the radiation in Belarusian villages, but the idea that the people living there might have figured out something important about what it means to be truly alive. Maria Urupa sits in her kitchen in Kupavate, now 85 years old, surrounded by the silence of a village that once housed 678 people. Only 16 remain. The rest died of old age, not radiation sickness. She tends a garden that experts say is too dangerous for human consumption. She drinks water from a well that authorities consider contaminated. She sleeps in a house that's officially uninhabitable. And she's outlived most of the people who were relocated to safety in 1986. This is what choosing yourself actually costs. It costs you the comfort of institutional support, the security of expert guidance, the safety of following official recommendations. It costs you the ability to blame others when things go wrong, the luxury of being a victim of circumstances beyond your control. The Samosli teach us that the most dangerous thing isn't radiation or contamination or invisible threats in the environment. The most dangerous thing is giving up your right to decide what's acceptable for your own existence. They show us that home isn't just a place, it's the courage to live authentically in a world that, constantly tries to convince you that someone else knows better than you do about what your life should be. The 197 Somozli still living in the Belarusian exclusion zone aren't just surviving in radioactive villages, they're preserving something that, honestly, modern life tends to destroy. The knowledge that you are the ultimate authority on your own existence, that your personal judgment about your own life is more valuable than any expert opinion, and that living authentically is worth more than living safely. Their quiet revolution continues every single day, in every meal grown in contaminated soil, every night spent in officially dangerous houses, and every morning that, well, proves experts wrong about what human beings actually need to thrive. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.